This is the LatinNews Podcast. I'm your host, Richard McColl, here in Bogota, Colombia. This week's episode is focused on Guatemala, and we're speaking to expert Tiziano Breda, who is the senior analyst for Latin America and the Caribbean at ACLED. That's the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data. And we're going to be discussing current events in Guatemala. He's in Italy at the moment. Welcome on the LatinNews Podcast, Tiziano.
Hi, Richard. I'm a very avid listener to the podcast, so thanks for having me.
Obviously, flattery will get you everywhere, and that's a great way to start this. But Tiziano, Guatemala at the moment. Let's just give our listeners a little bit of an overview of what's going on. We have elections next year in Guatemala, presidential elections. So President Bernardo Arévalo is coming to the end of his mandate. What can we say, looking at mid-2026, has been or will be reflected as his legacy as president? Because it was such a, and again, it was that glitch in the matrix of Bernardo Arévalo and Semilla getting into power.
Yeah, it really is quite hard to believe that it's already past 2 years and a half since Bernardo Arévalo took office. And in a way, this feeling stems from the fact that much of his presidency has been distinguished by constant threat and constant legal actions brought forward by the Attorney General's office, particularly in the figure of the former Attorney General, Consuelo Porras, with several attempts to nullify the elections results, to impede his swearing-in ceremony, eventually succeeding in cancelling the party, the Semilla party, that since March no longer exists, basically. So his 23 deputies still sit in parliament, but they do not represent anymore a formally recognized ruling party. And this has translated, and is probably was part of a strategy by the political forces that, in a way, were allied with or had relations with the Attorney General Consuelo Porras, because it was precisely designed to slow down the government, to impede his legislative agenda to be brought forward. And indeed, there has been some reform that has been brought forward, particularly on sort of infrastructure projects that have been identified and have started to be put on the way, and a law against, for example, the monopoly, which is, I was reading, Guatemala was one of the last countries, if not the last country in Latin America, that didn't have a legislation against monopoly, and that's telling about the sort of economic and political system that has governed the country for the past few decades. But other than that, and also due to the fact that, of course, as I was saying, 23 Semilla, or let's say officialist deputies, sit in Congress, but the Congress has 160 deputies. So he could not count really on any majority in Congress by far. He had come to some agreements with other parties, but of course, to push forward reforms and laws, of course, it was difficult since the very beginning. So in essence, 2 years and a half has passed, and really not much, I would say, has changed in the countries. That there's no clear achievement that the government has been able to put forward, and instead, of course, the disillusionment among Guatemalans has grown. He was not elected with a strong mandate, as you were saying. His election was a bit the result of an attempt to block other candidates that seemed to be favored for the elections, and he resulted to be the one that nobody was thinking he could be voted, and it ended up being elected. But so he did not have a strong mandate, but still a high approval rate at the beginning, around 80%, and now it's down to 30-something%, because actually Guatemalans feel some stasis, some stagnation in the government, which has also had to deal with a severe deterioration of security in the past year or so.
I think this is incredibly important to think about this. It's like he's a symbolic president for what he represents, but not what he has been able to achieve, because you're saying very little, a stagnation. And yes, security has obviously worsened. Perhaps we can put that into context. What are the current peace and security issues? What's it look like in Guatemala right now?
So in Guatemala, if you allow me to take a step back, it's a country that just 15 years ago used to be the most violent in Central America, which was already one of the most violent regions in Latin America and so in the world. So in 2009, it had over 40 homicides per 100,000 inhabitants. And much of this violence originated from criminal structure that were basically encrusted in the state and had participation of political, military, and economic actors. So the CICIG came in, this UN-backed anti-impunity commission, and through the strengthening of investigative capacities of authorities, the promotion of some legal reforms that provided more tools to authorities to actually go after violent organizations, this essentially allowed the country to dismantle over 70 criminal organizations in the span of a decade. And this contributed, some argue, to a certain extent to a decrease in the numbers of violence and the levels of homicide. So by 2019, when the CICIG was shut down, the country was registering around 15, 16 homicides per 100,000 inhabitants, with a steady decrease over a decade. Now, as I was saying, the CICIG was shut down because it dared to investigate, to open a case against then President Jimmy Morales and his brother and son. So he faced the political backlash that this sparked. On the other hand, under Consuelo Porras, the Attorney General's office then became a place for political vendettas rather than an institution that would go after violent crime and corrupt actors. So little by little, and after the pandemic, and of course the impact that it had on the livelihood of many Guatemalans, including in very marginalized communities where gangs breed, all of these sort of started to reverse this downward trend that the country had experienced. So little by little, it didn't escalate, but violence was going up again. It had plateaued more or less, but last year, there was an outbreak of violence between the MS-13, one of the country's main gangs, and the Barrio 18 or 18th Street Gang, the other very notorious outfit in the region. Because essentially, the MS-13 apparently decided to take out what was an intermediary for both gangs, basically a drug supplier, and provided them with the drugs that then they could distribute in their own turfs. So probably the MS-13 got hold of a different supplier and basically killed one of the leaders of this supplier, which is called the Los Caradura gang. And this prompted an outbreak of war, particularly in Guatemala City and surroundings. We, in ACLED, recorded around 100 clashes between organized crime groups, particularly gangs, in 2025 alone. And this definitely contributed to a 10% increase in the homicide rates in the country last year. And this has been accompanied by some notorious cases that sparked outcry in the country. There were a return to violent prison mutinies. It was something that wasn't seen for a while in a country that had experienced a lot of, unfortunately, very violent events in prisons over the past 20 years. And also, this essentially was coupled by a great escape by 20 Barrio 18 high-level members that prompted a governmental crisis, actually, and forced Arévalo to dismiss then Interior Minister Francisco Jimenez, and that was taken advantage of by political forces in the opposition and by the Attorney General's office that would have probably issued an arrest warrant for this case against the former minister, who had to flee the country. And this year, to finalize my comment, also related to prisons, after the government tried to transfer certain high-level gang members to a facility that had stricter controls, the Barrio 18 launched a series of attacks that killed 11 police officers in just one day in January this year. And this also prompted a very difficult moment for the government and increased the demands for a more confrontational, hardline approach to crime, which is something that Arévalo, in principle, had argued against. No, he had argued for more violence prevention, strengthening of investigative bodies and intelligence capacities for the police, all processes respecting the rule of law, the democratic timings, and so on and so forth. And he was pushed, of course, to change slightly his route.
It seems so clear that security issues and politics go hand in hand, especially Latin America in general, but Central America, Guatemala being previously the most violent country. But if we look obviously not far away, we have to look at El Salvador and, of course, the mano dura of Nayib Bukele, the president there, we covered recently on the podcast. But I imagine that you have a very vociferous percentage of the population saying that they want the kind of a Bukele-style cleanup within Guatemala. But that's not Arévalo's, it's not what he campaigned on, but I guess he's being pushed towards that in some extent. How much is this affecting his governing style, Tiziano?
Yeah, I think he has been able to, or he's had to walk a very tight rope, no? Balancing on one hand, as you were saying, the growing demand for a more hardline, mano dura approach that sort of shows force by the state, that increases sanctions of gang-related crimes, that employs the military to go after violent crime, which is something that in this particular time of history is also very much welcome, if not very much fostered by the US administration under Donald Trump in the region. So there's this growing demand on one hand, and on the other, effectively the limits of what was being done by the government, which tried to respect all the different sort of procedural rulings that foresee, for example, the transfer of censored detainees from a facility to another, that obliges authority to respond to an habeas corpus, which in many cases were used by lawyers of these gang leaders to avoid this transfer, to revert these measures, to basically maintain the status quo that allowed them to rule from prisons onto the streets. So, in essence, rhetorically, but Arévalo has not given in until the very last bit of these demands. So he's not endorsed a discourse of war on gangs, on shielding the security forces from any persecution if they commit crimes and abuses, or things like of this sort, which other governments, starting with neighboring Bukele, but also Noboa in Ecuador, have done. But at the same time, he did have to give in on specific issues. He, for example, basically accepted or promoted legislation that defines gangs as terrorist organizations at the end of last year. He promoted the construction of a new prison, maximum security prison, which rings a bell when somebody says SECOT. It had to impose emergency measures following this particularly violent event in January for over 4 months, various states of siege and then prevention, essentially states of emergency in which certain rights are restricted and the military can operate more easily alongside the police, were implemented. And at the same time, more recently, an article came out that described how the government has also reached out to the US in a way to ask for greater support in carrying out operations against drug trafficking groups. So in a way, he had to give in partially to certain measures that weren't probably in its toolkit at the beginning, but at the same time, he did not completely abandon the sort of rhetorical approach to the matter, and in a way has never tried to use these emergency measures to go after different things than violent crime. We saw that in El Salvador, Bukele has also used these emergency measures to go after, unfortunately, the opposition, or to less transparently fund specific projects. Arévalo has not gone down that route.
That in itself is a relief. So we can't say that under Arévalo then shifting his politics to a more hardline, again, let's say a tempered hardline politics, because it seems he wants to stay true to his actual political belief. But at the same time, we can say that there hasn't been like a backsliding towards authoritarianism, as we've seen in so many other places where by decree you declare again this state of emergency and then just extend it almost indefinitely. You mentioned Ecuador, we've seen that. We've talked about that on the podcast. El Salvador as well, very recent episodes here on the LatinNews Podcast. That would be a concern. If we talk a little bit about the gang violence in Guatemala, you mentioned the MS-13 and the Barrio 18, 18. Guatemala is a transshipment country. So is it the kind of the same gang violence as was seen prior to Bukele in El Salvador, extortion-based, controlling urban sections within cities and so on? Is that the kind of gang violence we're looking at in Guatemala?
There are certainly some similarities, but also some differences. First of all, the similarities relate to some of the actors that are involved in violence and in crime in Guatemala. Of course, you mentioned MS-13, Barrio 18. These are all gangs that originated among Central American migrants in the US in the 90s and then spread through Central America, so to Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, following mass deportations by the Clinton administrations back then. So nominally, some of the actors are similar. The great difference compared to El Salvador, for example, is that these groups, first of all, could count on fewer members. The latest estimate is that they could count to between 10,000 to 14,000 members, whereas in El Salvador, we will be talking about 4 times, 5 times these figures. And that's also because geographically they are more concentrated than they were in El Salvador when they were present in over 90% of the country's municipalities just a few years ago. And in comparison, in Guatemala, this phenomenon concentrates much more around the capital, the surrounding municipalities and departments, and to some extent, Quetzaltenango, which is the second largest city in the country. But essentially, the extortion rackets are more prevalent in the city and surroundings. But also, among the differences is the fact that, as you said, Guatemala is much more prominent than El Salvador in the drug trafficking trade in the region. So, of course, it has a much bigger extension. It has much bigger ports through which some of the drugs can flow through. It has a lot of green in the northern part of the country, in Petén and Las Verapaces, which are used by organized crime groups to build illegal airstrips and traffic also by air, something you can't really do in a super highly populated country and small, such as El Salvador. So whereas in the cities, you have great presence of gangs, in the more sort of border departments and maritime departments, there are strong drug trafficking clans. Compared to some 12 years ago, when the Zetas from Mexico tried to make inroads in the country and really sparked a very violent disputes for drug trafficking, let's say a kind of balance, a kind of equilibrium has been reached in that sense. So the violence in those departments is not much for the competition among groups, but just perpetrated by very powerful clans. In Huehuetenango, Los Huistas, and in Zacapa, the Lorenzana family, and so on and so forth. But of course, it also means that gangs, in a way, had increased their participation in not only extortion activities, but also, increasingly so, drug peddling, first and foremost. But according to the security minister, recently said that even in drug trafficking, they had increased their participation in a way. So the increase the diversification of these activities has been greater in Guatemala, which of course becomes problematic if the main actors, of course, then start fighting for the control of these activities, as we've seen since mid-2025.
There's a complexity here, and we're getting closer to it, I think. When you talk about the clans and the criminal gangs, of course, we said the MS-13, the Barrio 18, how connected are these then to the political system and the sort of the corrupt clientelist system within politics itself? Because that's something that's come up on this podcast on every time we've mentioned Guatemala. It's been that. So where does this sort of become the fluid point between these clans and elites and the families and the political authorities?
I think we can start with an anecdote on this question, Richard, which is one of the main leaders of the Body 18, or if not the maximum leader in Guatemala, alias El Lobo, so Aldo Dupié, engaged, or like his partner, is called Maria Castañeda Torres. Now, this surname, the second one in particular, may sound to many Guatemala followers familiar, because she's the niece of Sandra Torres, the presidential candidate that Arévalo faced off in the runoff in 2023, and a long-time political figure, former first lady of the country. We're talking about a very close relationship. Now, we can't, let's say, by osmosis, accuse Sandra Torres of the crimes or the relationship that her niece has developed, but that certainly gives a hint as to how close to the highest echelons of the political circles some connections between organized crime groups and gangs, and politicians can run in Guatemala. Another example was that the former president of Congress was a relative of Los Huistas, the other group, the drug trafficking group that I was referring to in a few minutes ago. That gives a hint as to, let's say, again, relatives cannot be blamed for the sins of others, but in a way, the fact that some or very known organized crime groups are engaged, connected, have links with the highest echelons of political figures in the country is certainly a hint, as to how deep these connections run.
You stepped around it very carefully, and I commend you on that. But yes, there's no way that these families don't know that it is ongoing. And so therefore, I would suggest, as much as I can, is a very close relationship without being overly outspoken about this. So when we talk, I think, again, we come back to this hardline approach, new prisons, asking for US support. This puts obviously Bernardo Arévalo even more into let's say, the President Trump sphere of influence, and under the hawkish Marco Rubio, of course, of Cuban descent, but very much interested in the Latin hemisphere, let's say. But Bernardo Arévalo was not invited to participate in this Shield of the Americas that took place a few months ago. But so it seemed like it was a more politically aligned group of regional leaders rather than an actual overarching shield to stop drug trafficking, illegal migration, and criminality.
Indeed, this has been carefully handled by both the US government and the Guatemalan government. I would say on the US side of things, there's been a clear attempt to give the Shield of the Americas an ideological footprint, right? So beyond the kind of policies that the governments offered to bring forward, or that the US demanded that they bring forward, the Shield of the Americas, in essence, is a platform for governments that have ideological affinity with Washington. And that's been proven by basically a statement that was put out recently by the Shield of the Americas leaders on protests in Bolivia. Nothing that was related to drug trafficking or how to tackle crime in the region, so on and so forth. And so inviting Bernardo Arévalo could in a way was not in line with the political purpose of the meeting itself. On the other hand, also Bernardo Arévalo has avoided being framed as a political vassal of the US, of being too aligned or subservient towards the US, and has preferred to opt for a more pragmatic engagement with the US, giving way for greater cooperation on migration issues, accepting a lot of deportation flights. Recently, unfortunately, also giving into pressure to let the Cuban doctors that were present in the country go as part of this overall regional policy by Washington to isolate Cuba and deprive it from any basically source of income. But at the same time, without necessarily, as we were discussing, fully buying on the militarized rhetoric that only pure force can solve the crime issue in the region. So I think the two have been dancing this tango carefully. And essentially, of course, there's been some great engagement with the Ministry of Defense traveling to the margins of the summit meeting. U.S. State Secretary Marco Rubio visiting Guatemala. So they both have basically maintained a productive, pragmatic relationship, even if not fully endorsed and publicized as a full-fledged political alignment, basically.
A working relationship, pragmatic being a word. How does that play at home? How do Guatemalans feel about this? Do they feel they need greater US intervention, or they're happy to be more, let's be more on the sideline about this? How is this playing back in Guatemala?
Great question indeed. I think much of the government's approach to this issue has precisely been a result of the fact that it needed to respond to different currents within the country. Certainly, the Semilla Party has some wings, not all the Semilla Party, but has a strong leftist leaning ideology and vision of the region that is certainly not very fond of US interventionism and meddling with internal affairs and so on and so forth. So that's the reason why I would say Arévalo has refrained from being identified as basically a full-fledged ally and vassal of the US. On the other hand, most Guatemalans recognize the importance that maintaining good relationship with the US has for the country's stability. Around 1/5 of the population lives in the US. Just think about that. And also, when it comes to private investment, to trade, the US is undoubtedly the greatest partner that the country has in the hemisphere and in the world. From a private sector perspective, from an overall societal perspective, Arévalo has also had to avoid direct confrontation with Washington, which would have been particularly impactful and would have had repercussions internally for the stability of its government.
Yeah, of course, let's say poking the Trump tiger would be very much detrimental to Guatemalan politics and political stability of Bernardo Arévalo, certainly. We need to jump topics a bit because it's June 2026, and we know that Consuelo Porras, the former Attorney General from 2018 to 2026, if I'm not mistaken, was she appointed by Jimmy Morales back in the day when he was president. She's no longer Attorney General. We've got Gabriel Garcia Luna taking over. We can say that Consuelo Porras really was a figure of significant authority and power in Guatemala. So what can we expect really now of this quite seismic change taking place in the country?
Yeah, this year has been particularly important because besides the Attorney General's office, the Attorney General, other important figures in the judiciary have been elected: a new constitutional court, a new Supreme Electoral Tribunal, and all of these processes have actually brought about partial change and partly positive, of course, change. For example, Garcia Luna was elected. He has a strong trajectory within the judiciary, but according to people far more knowledgeable than me on the Guatemalan judicial conundrum, there would have been even better options that were eventually prevented from being selected to make it to the final shortlist. In Guatemala, the president has to appoint an attorney general and pick it from a selection of 5 candidates that come from different organs of the state, right? But still, the figure of Garcia Luna, the sort of initial moves also that he's brought forward are promising in a way. He's already dismantled the FACI, the anti-corruption special unit within the Attorney General's office that was created under the wings of the CC. But then after the shutdown of the CC turned into a bit of what I was referring to before, a platform for political vendettas. Under the FACI, a lot of political cases against journalists, activists, civil society representatives, and politicians have been brought forward, whereas high levels corruption cases unmasked by journalists, by investigative journalism, etc., were basically let fall on deaf ears. And that's a huge change. As I was saying, Consuelo Porras has not only been a constant thorn on the side of the Arévalo administration, but she's overseen a progressive deterioration of the institution's credibility and image, no? Because she's let go over 500 between administrative officials and attorneys within the institution, some 24 judicial operators, very well-known judicial operators that had spearheaded very high-level corruption cases, have had to flee the country over the past few years. And yeah, in essence, had focused much more resources to prosecute, to hinder the ability of Bernardo Arévalo's government to carry out any sort of political reforms, and let go one of its main mandate, right, which is effectively tackling violent crime. It's true that funded by the US, there was a project that expanded the Attorney General's office presence throughout the country, and that sort of was an improvement in a way, but was an improvement because it gave a clearer, or it made it easier for people to go and denounce if they saw or were victim of a crime. Just a few years ago, if you were from Alta Verapaz or Huehuetenango, you had to travel all the way to the country's capital to file a complaint on extortion, on whatever. And it can be a 6, 7, 10 hours ride just to go there, plus the resources. So many crimes went underreported. So having more offices throughout the country at least helps better map what's the current state of play. But at the same time, the efficiency of the Attorney General's office in giving continuity and opening cases and bringing justice to those cases has dropped dramatically. I think it was just around 6% of resolved cases compared to the complaints last year. So it's really an inefficient, basically, as it has become a very inefficient, despised also institution because of the role it has had in undermining the country's democracy, trying to basically annul the results of the elections in 2023. So there's a great hope with the mandate of Garcia Luna that things can improve, that the institutional image can be overhauled, and so on and so forth. But of course, these things take time. It's not from one day from another. And as you were pointing out at the very beginning, Arévalo doesn't have that much time left. In 1 year, there will already be the election. So the country will soon enter a pre-electoral period. And so, yeah, Arévalo appears to be laying the groundwork for next government to pick it up and contribute not to this sort of democratization, transparentization, if you allow me this term, and improvement of the state's capacity to respond to citizens in a clearer way and less corrupt way. But it remains to be seen whether the next president will pick up this groundwork or will just reverse it and try to reestablish this sort of kleptocratic, clientelistic way of doing politics that preceded Arévalo.
So I think Attorney General in Guatemala would be a thankless task of a job to try and pick up and start with. It seems to me that Consuelo Porras, again, with this project from the United States of expanding the Attorney General's office around the country, obviously, as you said, incredibly positive, but then you've created what is an immense and largely, I would say, immovable judicial backlog by dismissing so many functionaries. So on the one hand, you make it look efficient because you can denounce crimes. But on the other hand, it's just never, ever going to see the light of day. So again, quite clever if that's what you wanted to do. And with no, Consuelo Porras has been, as you said, a thorn in the side of the current government. And I'm sure that Bernardo Arévalo is celebrating her departure. But remember, it's only been a month, really, since Garcia Luna is in this position. Again, we really don't know what's going to happen in the coming months. And finally, Tiziano, we've talked a lot, and I know it's late in Italy now, but I want to ask, are people already moving their political bases around for potential sizing up to run for presidential elections next year? Are we seeing candidates already making themselves known?
Yeah, there are already some movements. Of course, it's still very early to tell how many candidates, how many parties will participate in the election. But there are some initial movements that I think can be spelled out. First of all, let's talk with the ruling party. We said Semilla has been cancelled, and he had already split into two factions before that happened. So there was Samuel Perez, a very young and renowned representative of Semilla, that basically, due to divergences in the management of nominations in Congress and so on and so forth, separated and created his own movement, Raíces, so roots. And it would certainly try and register this new party to run for the election in 2027. I'm not sure how will it fare because, of course, as we were saying at the beginning, much of Arévalo's fortune was the fact that some of the most favorite candidates were not allowed to run in 2023, such as Telma Cabrera, which had a strong appeal among the indigenous population in the country, and Carlos Pineda, who was basically this sort of outsider businessman that attracted a lot of sympathy over social media. And this time he is likely to try it again and maybe can capitalize on that initial sympathy that he was attracting. There's, of course, also the everlasting, undefeatable, hard movements that see in the figure of Suri Rios, the daughter of Guatemalan dictator, essentially. Rios Montt, that is certainly trying to go for another presidential attempt, and may certainly attract the interest and the support of the most conservative military, private sector sort of sectors. But I'm not sure if that way of doing politics, that what she represents, is somehow likely to make a comeback in the country. I think something has changed. The role that the 48 cantons, the indigenous population played in safeguarding democracy in 2023, I think has revived certain citizens' consciousness about the importance of defending democracy and the difference that it can make to try and go out of the street and face off a system that seemed undefeatable. But now there's a new Attorney General, there's a new Constitutional Court, there's a new Supreme Electoral Tribunal, there's a government, an outgoing government that certainly would not try and meddle with the election in an undemocratic way and will be happy to support any transition to a future government. So I would say maybe I'll be completely wrong, but I would say it's hard to believe that these more traditional parties and representatives will make a comeback. But on the other hand, this could go in a different direction, which we are seeing in other countries in the region, which does not mean that you have another progressive democratic leader arising, but rather dissatisfaction with the traditional party system expresses in the rise of a more populist figure, such as De la Espriella in Colombia, or Bukele, as it used to be, and so on and so forth. And therefore, there are several possibilities in that direction. One is this Carlos Pineda. There's also Roberto Arzu, who comes from a very well-known political family in Guatemala City. Basically, I don't know how many of the past mayors have had Su as surname. They're very powerful in the city, but somehow he's detached from his relatives and is taking on a more sort of independent approach and figure to politics. So I think he could also stand a chance in this election. Closing on this note, I would just add that though the government is preoccupied that in a way the next election could rekindle certain or could repeat certain events of violence that took place during the past election. So luckily there's already a plan being drafted to try and identify the main hotspots to prevent political violence ahead of the election from happening. But certainly in an era of transition, of different power dynamics at the national level, but possibly also starting to trickle down also at the local level. This in a country which has a strong influence now of also illicit economies can certainly raise the risk for more violence at the local level against political figures to emerge.
We certainly hope no political violence and that these elections in 2027 come across peacefully and democratically in as much as possible. I think there was an Arzu who was president when I lived in Guatemala back in 1998. I think we're a very political name for Guatemala City. Thank you so much, Tiziano, for your insights into the situation in Guatemala. As always, there are, I would say, glimmers of hope. Bernardo Arévalo really did represent a change. Of course, he got in more by the mismanagement of Consuelo Porras, but it allowed for this change. And maybe this has shifted, as you say, the political grounds on which Guatemala has been run and these families that have continually possessed the power. But fascinating how the stars aligned for so many important things in 1 year with the Constitutional Court, the Attorney General, and so on. It's really interesting how that should happen. So therefore, this will have an effect on next year's elections, definitely. It's been an absolutely incredible conversation. I've been talking to Tiziano Breda, who's the senior analyst for Latin America and the Caribbean for ACLED. That's the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data. I believe you have a report coming out soon about Venezuela and Colombia, so hopefully we'll talk about that in the future as well, but I'll keep an eye out for that. Tiziano, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks so much to you for having me, Richard. It's been a great pleasure.
It has been an absolute pleasure for me as well. I've been your host, Richard McColl, here in Bogota, Colombia. Remember, you can subscribe to the LatinNews Podcast wherever you get your podcasts, Spotify, iTunes, YouTube, and so on. Very easy to find. And we're out every fortnight with more issues and items of interest from the region. So thank you again, and goodbye.